Photocopying our drawings is a great way to get development of media in a safe way. By copying on cartridge paper, we've got a heavier weight paper which will take all sorts of different materials and techniques. We can collage different papers down onto the surface so that as we colour wash, print or layer up, we get completely different effects depending on the paper we're working on top of. PVA glue is usually the best sort of glue to use, but if you've only got a glue stick, then use that, but make sure that you really stick things down carefully. Try and secure as much of the paper as you can with the glue so that then you don't end up with bits that lift and flap as you start to work over the top. You can layer one surface over another, and with tissue paper you can either put it down flat or you can use a slight wrinkle. Please don't use tissue paper balls, they never ever look good and don't do anything for your work. Make sure that any loose flappy bits are stuck down, and then you are ready to start to move forward, putting different blocks of paper or colour in different areas. I use verticals and horizontals quite often because that gives quite a nice structure to the piece of work that I'm working on. You can collage down newspaper text, bits of old flyers, keywords that you've cut out of magazines, anything really that creates a different sort of surface so that any paints or inks will react differently when they go over the top. Using either a white acrylic paint or some old emulsion paint, you can very quickly start to bring pattern and texture into your work. With a bit of an old sponge, just sponge it onto something with a raised surface, like a bubble wrap or maybe a recycled bit of textured wallpaper where there's that raised surface. You sponge it on, turn it over and print off. Don't worry if you're printing onto white paper that you can't see the patterns, because later on when we come to colour wash they will all start to emerge and come through. Remember, you get different sizes of bubble wrap which can give you slightly different scaled effects, and also a variety of different types of textured wallpapers that you can use to print off. You can see here this has been used for other colours before, but I'm just going back over it with the white so that I can bring those swirling sections into my background. I already have areas where I played around with some stenciling, and I've got my tissue paper coloured sections so that the areas stand out. Here you can see the before with the colour and then the after with the printed texture over the top. Then start to review and think about what you might want to bring in. What colours might you want to blend in with the white to start to get subtle layers of texture and pattern. This needs to completely dry. Once it's dried, you can start to colour wash with coloured inks over the top. It's best if you get plain water on a sponge and wet the background first, as this helps carry the ink quickly into the areas. Don't rub too much, we want to be quite quick, because if you start to rub backwards and forwards too much, then the paper will start to bobble and lift and it won't have quite the same effect. Once you've colour washed over the area and the ink is still wet on the paper, you can bring in some salt, just the stuff that you would put on your chips at home, and you sprinkle that into the surface. If you leave it to dry, it will then dry with a slightly speckled effect. It looks like I'm putting a lot on here, but actually not a lot was coming out. Less is quite often more for this. You might then decide that you want to bring in some other colours into the background, maybe to create a little bit more definition. Here I'm splattering bits of yellow on, seeing how that works. Because the ink is wet, it's starting to run and create little explosions. I then start to paint in certain areas in a more controlled way, just to build up certain bits of colour and contrast. Think carefully about the colours that you do combine though. You want colours that work well together, that are harmonious. You don't want to overlap your complementary colours, the contrasting colours, as obviously you will end up with a brown colour. Remember that colour can create a mood or an atmosphere. So quite often when we use sort of blues and greens, it's quite cool, it's quite depressive, and that's the sort of effect that I'm trying to create here with this upbeat Alice in Wonderland image, but trying to give it a darker edge. Leave it to completely dry. When it is completely dry, you can work back into it. You can add details to redefine certain areas. You can start to add additional bits of things into the background or into different areas of highlights. You can see here that I'm just experimenting, picking out different shapes, different patterns, bringing in some more yellows and some more blues to create a little bit more definition. I start to work into the mouth and the nose area, but actually for what I'm trying to do in the mood, I'm going to come back and work into that later on. I'm using Tip-X, almost like a white paint around the edge and smudging it in, but you can also use paints as well. I've got board markers, and I've even used a little fine liner or a biro just to create a pretend stitch effect up the edges of those pieces of paper. You can collage other things into the surface like I've done with the masking tape over the mouth, and text can quite easily give you a sort of a feel to the work that you might want to have. Just by adding these details, I've made this image quite dark and menacing.